A Wilderness of Sweets by Gilda Cordero-Fernando. I was 12 when the war broke out and 16 when it ended. And during most of that sad and beautiful time, we lived in an old 2-story house and sang along. A bright, irreverent boy named Padel was in love with me, and I with him, and inevitably, he lived in the house in front. Padel, he was quick and smallish, had one gold gap tooth, and a complexion mother described as grayish-blue. But to me, he was Paris and Apollo and Adonis, and each day I died 1,000 deaths for him. It was 1942 and my mother was working as a dietitian in an emergency hospital. But my father, who was an army captain just released from Capas, had no job, and he would go into small buy and sell ventures. He would find a man who wanted to sell a piece of land and find another who wanted to buy it. He would purchase a backyard full of twisted steel windows and sell the whole lot 2 days after for a profit. My eldest brother Pabi's wife, Yoying, had just had a baby, and Pabi too bought cheap pieces of jewelry and resold them. Or he bought 3 ratty blankets today and exchanged them for 6 almost new denim pants tomorrow. Mother, too, bought 2 20-pounds of fresh butter from a black market dealer, but before she could resell them, our ancient refrigerator broke down and all the stuff melted. Business was contagious. And eventually, Yoying, my other brother Leo, our neighbors Esme, Rosie, and of course, Badel, and I decided to put up our own store. Rosie's stepmother had once run a botica, and she sold us her counter, cash box, shelves, and jars. The boys put up a collapsible stall in front of the church, and we sold everything in it. Ladies' wooden shoes, oil lamps, jumping watches, and some moldy dictionaries we had discovered in Esme's old piano bench. Macrame string bags, akebono and pirate cigarettes, Tim brooches dipped in food coloring, a confection called panchitos, and then slices of sour pineapple suspended in some questionable cloudy solution. The profits of the oil lamps were mostly Esme's and Leo's because they collected the tin cans out of which the lamps were made. That of the macrame bags was Pabi and Yoying's because Yoying made them. The capital for the wooden shoes was Badel's, but I get a percentage from the profits, for I helped to fetch the clogs from a queer, castle-like house in San Juan. The earnings of cigarettes supplied by Leo's Japanese friend were consequently Leo's. But the sun-dried peanuts were Rosie's because we dried them on a strip of sidewalk in front of her house. And over this intricate business empire, I was appointed manager. For I was parsimonious and slow in mathematics, and no 5-centavo note could come in or go out without being entered into a worry account book.
Budel liked to sit in the stall and joke about my esoteric computations, popping panchitos in his mouth, or peanuts, or fishing a sopping pineapple from the foggy jar. I'd list each item that slid down his gullet and shake before his face a kilometric and overdue account. "My, you'd make a mean wife," he'd say, trying on a brooch. He'd squint down at the notebook, following the divisions and the fractions and the square roots up and down the margin, clucking with delight. Ah! His finger would pause at some stooped and garnelled digit. "It should be a 9, not a 5. You're lucky to have me around." And that was how the sessions always ended. I liked to go along when Leo and Esme bought the tin cans up to the house of Mr. Pajamas who made the lamps. He was Esme's father and lived next door, and he was supposed to be dying of some mysterious liver fluke and consequently wore his pajamas from break of morn till the set of sun. His wife was a petite, shriveled woman with a flurry face, and they later lost Esme's 6-year-old brother during the confusion of the liberation. Although, couldn't foretell this, and they were always giggling behind Mr. Pajama at the time, back and being quite mean. The 6-year-old son was supposed to have been seen fleeing with the negro, and was never found again. No one reported has seen the child die, though Mr. and Mrs. Pajamas never lost hope, setting a place for the boy at their table each mealtime and spending a fortune following up leads, which I suppose is what made Esme slightly dorky. I mean, you don't wait for a ghost come to supper for years and not have it tell on you somehow. The years after the war, Esme's folk were still putting ads in the newspaper. The boy would have been 16 then, and they would even let the prospect live with them for a while, but something always came up to convince them that he could not possibly be their son. The last was a young man who had been found by a fisherman wandering alone in the woods after the liberation. But he promptly fell in love with Esme, which proved beyond doubt that he was not their son. And last we heard, Mr. Pajamas had become neurasthenic and was in danger of losing his mind. But at that time, he was just a cheerful inventor from whom we get our supply of lamps. He transacted all his business from a beach chair equipped with casters so he could move from one part of his room to the other without disturbing his liver flukes. The tin cans were scrubbed till they shone like halos and placed on a lazy Susan with all his tools, and this lazy Susan too had wheels and could be happily rolled about. The telephone was nailed to a piano stool which could also be pushed and pulled about. As a matter of fact, Mr. Pajamas combed his hair in front of a hand mirror screwed to a chair leg cemented onto a skate, and he could wheel around his lamp wicks on the enamel cover of a freezer mounted on a bicycle wheel. Near the window was a castered tin box enclosing a light bulb that heated coconut oil, and it could also cook an egg. And if he was warm, Mr. Pajamas cooled himself with an air nozzle that could clean a typewriter too. And all these were on casters and rolling merrily about. But the boys were growing away from us, Esme and I felt, as we busied ourselves with girl tasks, bleaching spots out of our dresses or sticking a needle in and out of an embroidery hoop. And indeed, they never had time. After a while, to take their turns at minding the store, their activities no longer centered solely around the street in front of our houses, and they spoke in whispers about a guerrilla paper Badel's father was putting out. We knew it was called The Patriot, and was mimeographed behind the stairs of Mr. Mercado's room, for we sometimes went up their stairs to borrow salt or vinegar from his wife. On Wednesdays, Leo and Badel rode out on their bicycles to distribute the paper, always leaving one on top of President Laurel's gate.
My brother Pabi was away from home more than anybody else. One morning, I heard him in our sala telling Badal about a certain mammy he was supposed to contact. When I asked them if this mammy lived in Paranaque, where I knew the guerrilla headquarters was, Pabi turned his back on me, and Badal put his hands in his pockets, pretending not to hear. So I went into the bedroom and looked into the pier mirror. My hair had been trimmed short to save on curling, and this made me look about 10 years old instead of 13. My back was as flat as a board, and so was my front. It was very discouraging. Some of Pabi's socks were in net bowls on Mama's bed, where she had been mending them, and I chose two and slipped them into the front of my dress, but they looked exactly like what they were, a pair of Pabi's holy socks. I experimented with them a bit, pushing the socks up so high they looked like a football player's shoulders, then down low like the peps of an old woman dragging her way to the grave. Then I put them in their proper place so that I had this mountainous phony bust and walked around top-heavy, frowning vilely at the walls and repugnantly down at my anguished suitors. And then I had this bright idea. I get Mama's bedsheet and rolled it up into a ball and placed it on my tummy. 7 months? But the front of my dress kept riding up so that I had to keep pulling the hem down. Oh, it was really such a bother to be pregnant in this heat. And that boring husband refusing to even hunt green mangoes? In this world, everything broken in the war. Roofs and toilets, and I could, Then the door swung open. "Why can't a girl have a bit of privacy, lads?" And Badel's face came around the door, and his jaw dropped quickly several inches. Then his eyes lighted up and crinkled with laughter. "Excuse me, missus," he said, ducking out. A couple of times the boys still had an old fit of exuberance smashed him dead with a broom. And one moonlit night they yelled for Esme and Rosie and me to play tombang preso with them in the empty lot in front of the bicycle shop. Leo put up 2 of the tin cans for ghosts and defined the limits of our hiding places, and dispersing, we laughed and screamed with abandon.
Remembering the best place to hide, I crawled into the back of Mr. Rosal's bicycle shop. It was pitch dark in the room, and soundlessly I crouched under a tricycle and waited. My heart was pounding in my throat, but after a while I became conscious that I was not alone in the room. A muffled sob came from deep within the hood of another tricycle, followed almost immediately by a man's urgent voice in a desolate attempt at consolation. A trouser leg rippled in the dark, and the man stood up. And from the shaggy hair and the hooked nose, I could tell it was Mr. Rosal. He had a large head, and he held it in his hands as if it were overripe and might snap from its stem any minute. He paced back and forth while the woman in the tricycle continued sobbing. Mr. Rosal knelt down on the floor and rested his head on our knees. Outside, shrill screams issued from the hiding places in the moonlight like small alarms. Miserably, I hugged my knees and waited, not daring to make a sound, fearing my heart would at any moment now burst open, spilling my blood and my secrets upon the dirt floor. Mr. Rosal did not move for a long time, and I thought he had fallen asleep. The seat of the tricycle creaked as the woman shifted her weight. After a while, the woman said, "I have to go," quite clearly, and stood up and fumbled inside her limp handbag. Sliding what looked like a stubby lipstick over her lower lip, the woman walked into a splash of moonlight by the windowsill. She turned towards the work table in a heavy fluid gesture, and I could see the face fully bruised with muddy tears. Of course I recognized it, but for a puzzled moment it seemed out of the context in a bicycle shop. It should be before a hot stove in the doorway of the house in front, calling Badel Mercado home to supper. Mr. Rosal joined Badel's mother in the pool of light, and I could hear him murmuring words of endearment. His loose old lips with the riches in them going plop, plop, plop as he talked. She was looking wetly up at him, with mounting horror, and I noted her chin that was beginning to sag, the crow's feet spreading down the corner of her eyes, and the tears spilling over their banks like a tiny wheel. I ran out of the bicycle shop and out into the street screaming, "Save me! Save me!" Badel pulled me to his hiding place behind some tangled garlic vines, asking me if I had hurt myself. I shook my head, gulping, and felt the laughter and the tears rising in my throat. Badel put his arms firmly about my shoulders and pushed my head down upon his breast pocket. The air was heavy with the oppressive odor of garlic flowers, and I thought I would swoon. "You're trembling," Badel said. "Whatever it is, don't think about it." I shut my eyes tight and bit my lip, and after a while, the funny feeling subsided. I lifted my head away from Badel embarrassedly, and unloosened his arms gently from my shoulders. He took my hand and kissed its dirty palm. "Please, don't see any more ghosts," he pleaded.
In those days, Esme came to the house each afternoon, and we sat idly on the hammock, languidly sipping calamansi juice in tall glasses. We read Macy Gregg and Faith Baldwin endlessly, haunting the garage of Mr. Magdalene, which had been turned early in the occupation into a lending library. People were so hungry for books. The garage conducted a thriving business, and Mr. Magsalin rented out everything from Jack London to telephone directories. Flipping the pages of some weepy love story, I would sometimes look up and find my Jonathan, or my Kim, or my Jeremy standing in the midst before me. I was on my way downtown, Badel would say, looking at me with Jonathan's eyes. But I decided to drop in on a hunch. It is almost like a tryst. Sometimes, when Esme was helping her father with the lamps, there was nothing to do but talk to silly Yoying. My brother's wife was extremely pretty, with smooth, almost transparent skin that showed little red veins and which she took great care of, never wiping her cheeks with a towel, but letting them dry in the air. When I laughed at her beauty routines, she said I was so raggy. Looking anyway, I'd grow up and never mind if I didn't comb my hair or popped off a couple of buttons, and I've grown, and alas, it's true. Yoying kept voluminous scrapbooks on diets and beauty tips, like how to dig out blackheads and whiteheads, how to remove fat from your hips and transfer it to your bust with proper exercise. But since neither Esme nor I had hip or a bust to begin with, her enthusiasm was lost on us. But Yoying had her points. You could, for instance, ask her things like, what is love? Or, where do babies come from? That you couldn't comfortably ask your mother or your brothers. But she gave such dreary answers, you got to wondering why people ever bothered to fall in love or make babies.
Once when Yoying was pregnant, I was swinging on the hammock and accidentally kicked her tummy. It wasn't much of a show, but she lost her balance and went sprawling into a roll of mats. She made a great fuss about it, waddling about and stroking her great belly, saying the baby would surely come out with a hair lip and I would be blamed. I pretended not to care, but long after she had forgotten the incident, I would wake up in the middle of the night and die with worry about it. Now, Yoying had a beautiful hair lipless baby and I had nothing. Stiff-legged, I would walk to the kitchen and collect strips of paper from the wood box. They were remnants of colored calendars and balance sheets fetched from the imprenta nearby are kindling, for in those days, I was not interested in writing. I was interested in growing. I drew continuously and voluminously, lining up my colored paper on the windowsill, prodding a half-asleep Yoying on the hammock to ask her opinion on some character or another I was incorporating in the continuing stories. Comic book fashion. Sometimes Badel passed by on the street below, on his way to some earth-shaking errand of coconuts or cigarettes for his father, and that would be the end of afternoon's chapter. Sighing, I would pillow my chin upon my wrist and stay motionless till dusk fell, and the sun sank into the gentle breast of evening. "Stop mooning around," my mother scolded, and deliriously, I would move from the window with an almost physical pain. Now I knew at last what it felt like to be in love. Like a bruised pomelo, like a drowned cat, like a toothache, like a lost button, like a mop. Our house had a flat space on its roof, accessible by a flight of straight stairs and a small trap door, through which you could step softly out into the dusk. And I liked to go up there when the wind was brisk. Up there you could see all the roofs of the neighboring houses, rising in uneven peaks and buffed with the suits of infinite cookings as the war progressed, getting shabbier and shabbier, till you could tell how many years had passed from the patches and the tinker stars that had blossomed on them, and the layering of marcas. The obsolete chimneys getting crookeder and crookeder, like men grown tired and old. My elbows and knees were always smeared from scaling the slope of ours. But towards the end of the war, our roof had been worn paper thin, and was quite a hazard to climb. But those days I could climb to the very top and feel the cold wind against my thin legs and play God. For I could look into the window of every house, into the high rafted kitchens, and at the closed, shadowy bedrooms and the cool, hushed parlors with their filigree clocks, frozen forever at some forgotten dinner hour. I could stretch out a hand and touch a rafter over Mr. Pajama's bedroom and see him huddled on his beach chair, pushing and pulling his cell phone about. Or I could into Mrs. Illustra's curtain of sausages, swinging above her hissing stove. And I could count the plates on her kitchen table and tell how many people were having dinner that night. Across the street, I could catch Mrs. Mercado stealing out of her house in a jersey dress. In her eternal quest for love, her mouth sullen, her hair wind-tossed, her shawl covering a bowl of sweets for her lover in the bicycle shop. If the stage show at the theater was finished early, the roofs would be washed with a pink light. The streets would be spilling with people and tricycles, on the corners always girls with violet makeup and tall pompadours striking some foolish bargain with Japanese officers, smiling serenely in their shining boots. But it was always pure and lonely in my stomach. And often, women who loved me in the roofs, I wept for all the grand impossible things Badal wished me to be. Which I couldn't. Someday, I would raise a flock of urchins, married to some uncomplicated man who loved me infinitely, who would make me the queen of his house and his brooms and mops, expecting no alchemy and no miracles. For even when Badal said he loved me, I could feel him sifting my qualities critically, chopping me into little pieces, pressing me like a sentence, reducing me to the lowest terms, to the least common denominator of my timorous and unequal self. And try as he might, he could fashion nothing out of the clod of me. My thoughts were cinders, my soul was shallow, it had no brook. But I love you, Badal. I would say to the first pale star, I love you for nothing. Keep it for a rainy day.
Schools open again in January, and every day Leo and I hang by the straps of some always full streetcar. It dislodged us 2 corners away from the school gate, and we passed by a sentry with a bayonet in his box before whom we had to make a 3/4 bow. The school garden had lost its flower beds, as had every garden and lost, and every vacant lot in the city replaced upon order of the food administration with neat rows of petchay and cabbages. If they didn't, we came across something like, see the shipping of XXXX far north and XXXX and the heights of XXXX and hear the XXXX singing. But we couldn't always hold the page up to the light and fill in the missing words. Once a month, a long-lipped Japanese censor who smelled of soy sauce came to examine our books and berate the teacher for the unglued portions. We did a lot of singing and physical education in the schoolyard. After the Japanese and national anthems, we made a quarter turn, bowed in assembly to the rising sun, and recited the 10 principles of the co-prosperity sphere. The principal turned to the tiny phonograph on the sill of his office window, and we began the radio taste exercise, which involved a good deal of inhaling and squatting. Then, we filed to our rooms and bought out our books and learned all about prehistoric times and divided yen and peso and read what was left of Walt Whitman. After that, it was time for current events, and we reported news like many household goods which were before the war taken for granted in America are now considered expendable. Vacuum cleaners, electric refrigerators, radios, phonographs, and sewing machines are scarce since they are no longer produced, and there is little choice in pots, pans, stoves, hardware, and dresses. Shirt, nails have been shortened, ruffles removed from nightgowns to save on cloth, and matches reduced to 1/4 of an inch to save on lumber. Then the bell rang, and we went out to the garden to hoe the petchay. The afternoons were devoted to Nipongo. I like Nipongo because we were given a bamboo brush and a silver of black ink and were made to paint squiggly characters starting from the back of our notebooks and from right to left. In the corridors and the washrooms, we spouted things like Domo arigato and Ohayo gozaimashita And Badal was my Tomodachi, although he aishimashita me very much.
The third and fourth years had a Japanese teacher, but we only had Miss Corpus, who was never more than one jump ahead of us, teaching the words she had learned from her Japanese instructor during the weekend. Miss Corpus was a fractious Visayan spinster given to mercurial rages. She had once played Caligula on teacher's night, and the mark it left was deep and lasting. She would stand on the platform and empty the vials of her wrath in a repertoire of Japanese insults upon our surprised and uncomprehending faces. The war had stranded Miss Corpus in Manila, and she was always trying to go home. Had once actually succeeded in boarding a grossly overloaded sailboat on a black market ticket, but the frail craft capsized in a storm downwent the ship, and most of the passengers but our Miss Corpus was unsinkable. She swam doughtily to shore with her valise, and was back in school the next morning, still slightly damp but magnificent and terrifying in her deathlessness. On special holidays, like the entry of the Japs into Manila or the fall of Singapore, we were marched over Jones Bridge, which was now Banzai Bridge, fluttering little paper flags with fierce red dots on them. We gathered in the Luneta and listened to some important Jap like Hideki, Tujo, or Yamashita, later hanged, make a growly speech in Nipongo, and when we were through, we F arms and shouted Banzai 3 times, although we hadn't understood a word. Once, General Aguinaldo was made to speak, and we thought he would say something hopeful like MacArthur will return. But the old general only talked about nationalism and food production in a frightened little voice. Then the crowd was dispersed, and we proceeded to Daitoa Avenue, or Mulawin, or Daye, or whichever were now the new names of the streets we lived in, flung up our. At the end of the school year, Leo got the highest grade in Nipongo, and he was invited by the long-lipped Japanese censor to work as an interpreter in their offices in the walled city. I didn't get any honors and was reduced to queuing for our 120 GM ration of rice at the neighborhood Biba store, and collecting water in drums from the faucets at night. Leo received a fabulous salary of 80 pesos a month, which was quite a boon to Papa and Mama, and he was able to see movies like Hot Spot, Chocolate Soldier, and some of the Tugo and Pugo stage shows. The nature of Leo's job consisted of listening to the foreign broadcasts from Radio Japan behind locked doors, while his friend Longleaves stretched out on a dusty divan and closed his eyes. Longleaves would dictate to Leo in Japanese what to write, and Leo would translate it into English. The pattern of their handiwork was invariable. The war in the South Pacific, where battles are being fought one after the other in rapid succession, will develop with much greater ferocity. Our enemy, the Americans, driven despair ate due to muddled war strategies, are undoubtedly flinging themselves against our defense lines with utter desperation. In the attacks on the Solomons and the Gilbert groups, they have lost in one coup more than 300 battleships times 2, and nearly 100,000 combatants times 3. The Japanese forces suffered no losses. Utter lie. Copies were passed on to the Shinbonsha, and the afternoon editions usually carried one of Leo's doctored new items. Leo's job provided Mr. Mercado with a source of authentic news safer than listening to the shortwave radio in the house of the old woman called Nanny in España. But Leo had to see Mr. Mercado only at night because he feared being followed. He would retranslate the news he had heard into its original version for the Patriot, and Badel would write a searing editorial to accompany it.
By this time, I knew all about the underground goings-on in the bodega. Once, I had even been sent by Pabi to fetch mimeograph paper from the old woman in España, whom I remembered as extremely fat and sitting with her voluminous nightgown arranged about her upon a tall chamber pot, and hence was drafted to the illustrations for the Patriot. Each afternoon, Badel would come into the study, hovering like a harpy over the windowsill where I sat drawing, while I burst out in goosebumps in the effort to please. He would pick up each half-finished sketch and examine it mock seriously. Too small, too large, head like a doorknob, face like an Andrew's sister's, legs like sticks, till I stamped my feet in desperation and tore my masterpiece to bits after all. What were we illustrating? A brochure of the Louvre? But in an hour, Badel would be back, begging me to draw another. Never mind if it's ghastly. Never mind if it stinks. His friends all conceded him a grudging admiration, recognizing the gifts he possessed to an inviolable degree. But he scourged everyone's soul up of its waters, for everything must be perfect for him. And so, Badel was always unhappy. And I thought, as I picked up my pencil wearily to repeat the 17th drawing that day, what a burden it must be to see the clockworks, to know the motives of hate and love, how things fall into place, where the earth sinks, where the seas flow, how every angel falls. In the latter part of the year 1943, the embroidery shop in Parañaque that was being used as guerrilla headquarters was raided by the Japs, and all of Pabi's friends descended upon our house. They stayed with us for a whole fortnight, and although one edge all the time, they bought into our gray lives an aura of festivity. We let them have all of our rooms except Mama's, where the family stayed, and the overflow was accommodated by Mr. Illustre. Although the young guerrilleros were well behaved and tried to help as much as they could, husking the floors, washing the dishes, and their own clothes, still the work involved was tremendous. Most of them were capas releases and still suffering from the effects of malnutrition and malaria. And Mother was forever boiling cinchona bark and giving liver transfusions and spoonfuls of the cod liver oil Maria Orosa was bottling from the biya of her own rivers. Of course, the guerrillas contributed their share in the marketing, but even then, one wasn't ever sure of finding enough in the markets anymore. And Mother's stocks of canned goods, which she had hoped would last until December, was finished in 2 weeks.
One Saturday, Joying and I were sent to market with a whole bayong of money, but it also happened to be the first raid of Manila by the Americans. When we went into the market, we found all the lights doused. Not a soul was in sight, the vendors hiding under the concrete white-tiled counters and their wares with them. We went from stall to stall, but no one would sell us anything, save a vegetable vendor who was proceeded to part with a bundle of kangkong for 100 pesos. And we never even saw her face, just a voice and a shaking hand reaching out under a counter surrounded by baskets. The guerrilla leader stayed in a bedroom in Mr. Illustre's house during those 2 weeks. It was the only house that eventually emerged unscathed from the liberation of Manila. When the last Japanese had retreated, the guerrilla leader remembered the house and put up a kangaroo court in Mr. Illustre's sala, beheading every suspected spy and collaborator in it. For days, the ravaged vicinity echoed with screams and beatings, and for months after the trials had ended, Mistress Illustre still couldn't scrub all the blood out of her floors. Through the years, Her young sons would hear ghostly footsteps and human groans and unexplained gushings from tightly shut faucets. And once, a niece coming down the kitchen to heat a bottle of milk for the baby saw a green apparition with ankle-length hair smiling at her from an open door. Much as the Illustrious loved the house, which had belonged to them for generations, living in it became unbearable. And 2 years after the war, they sold the house to a soda bottling company, and for considerably less than it was worth. To my mother's eternal dismay, some young guerrillo or another was from then on lodging with us for a day or two. And it was also about this time that a Japanese sentry, who had befriended Leo at his office, was regularly coming to the house for dinner. Ito, the sentry, was a gentle, slow-witted Jap, crumpled from the crown of his wilted cap to the strips of his never-straight leggings. He was 40, if I was a day, and he never risen above the rank of corporal. Ito would never become the tiger of Balaya. Mother was not surprised about Ito, for that was not the first time Leo had brought home strange and scrubbed creatures, and she treated the Jap with the same reverence that she accorded the wingless roosters and the leek horned goat in Leo's zoo in our backyard. That first time, just before leaving, Ito extracted a messy wallet around something which he placed reverently to my palm. Was it a love pill? Was it a quartz? Or a tektite? Or a secret weapon or a talisman? No, Leo translated. It is a stone from a Shinto shrine. I turned the pebble foolishly in my fingers, and as soon as Ito turned his back, I tossed it out the window. At least once a month, when he had a day's leave, Ito would come to the house with his clothes wrapped in a badly laundered bandana and beg to sleep there. Gallantly, Leo offered his room and his bed, but Ito would not hear of it, and my brother dug up a bedraggled cot from a cellar, and Ito slept in our vestibule. Ito volunteered no information about his life in the army. We asked him no question, and he asked none. Only later, when Pabi's whereabouts were betrayed, did Ito's visits raise our tardy suspicion. Ito liked music and never tired of listening to my thunderous rendition of love and devotion. My only peace. Sitting in the flaunce rocking chair by the window, Ito would gaze at the setting sun. At intervals, I would catch him through the polished lid of the piano, blowing his nose into the handkerchief. His sadness baffled me. Why should he cry when he was a conqueror? So I was always impatient with him, purposely hitting the wrong notes to annoy him. But Ito never noticed, wrapped up in communication with the setting sun.
To Leo's embarrassment, I delighted in tormenting Ito, placing a toad under his pillows or hiding the bathroom soap the minute he stepped out of the vestibule with a towel over his arm. With infinite patience, Ito would pick up the toad and set it loose in the garden, and after a while, he brought his own soap. Sometimes, Ito would be absent for quite a while, gone on a tour of duty somewhere in the zone. But one gentle evening, the door would open and Ito would stand uncertainly in the starlight, as crumpled and woebegone as ever. The last time we saw him was after a stint in New Guinea. It walked through the back door, carrying a monkey and a white bird. I was making some peanut brittle in the kitchen and they filled the air with their screeching, and I told Ito I would fry his bird in the skillet and drown his monkey in a pot. Ito laughed and told me in his horrible English that the white bird was for me. Its name was Peace. It was his gift, his present, better than a stone. The bird hopped on my shoulder, fluffed its feathers arrogantly, and gave my ear a sharp tweak. Leo made an elaborate cage with several perches and a crystal bath, and we fed the bird corn and bananas, setting the cage out each morning to warm in the sun. Peace had small bright eyes and a long tail and fluffed its feathers and crooned, and I showered upon it all the love and affection I had denied its master. Leo made an elaborate cage with several birds and a crystal bath, and we fed the bird corn and bananas, setting the cage out each morning to warm in the sun. Peace had small bright eyes and a long tail and fluffed its feathers and crooned, and I showered upon it all the love and affection I had denied its master. The small patio, which in happier times used to be lined with large tubs of rising dough, was broiling in the noonday sun. A stake had been driven into the ground in the center, and the woman was tied to it stark naked. A dirty Jap carrying a piece of burning kindling stood in front of the woman, and each time he asked a question, he applied its flaming end to the hair of her armpits. All her fingers were bleeding where the nails had been detached, and whenever the woman screamed, her milk-white body would writhe in a terrible agony. I held tightly to Battle's hand, and Esme whispered a shocked prayer.
People had gathered all over the fence around us, but no one could do anything. "She is not a spy," an onlooker who recognized the woman said. "She is a prostitute. They are torturing her because she would not give in to their captain." I could see Pabi's face, and Nick's expression frightened me. He was clutching the top of the board fence with both hands, and I could see that his knuckles were livid. For weeks we could not forget the incident, and the following months, as if by signal, our guerrilleros became extremely active. My own brothers were now assigned to sabotage submarine landings in Avotas, Allied forces making brief ocular inspections and pulling out an hour after. And somehow we knew that this young group in our midst was responsible for sending all the lights in the city blinking. The Dynamos and Caloocan were heavily guarded, and it was impossible to effect a total blackout. But one of the boys would crawl on his belly to knife a sentry and cut an electric wire, providing an almost as effective interval of intermittent darkness. Badel was with two new recruits, Nonong and Carding, assigned to contact scrap iron dealers to find out how much scrap was being bought by the Japs and being made into arms or used to repair the ailing Japanese battleships in Cavite. The newspapers were always bragging about the amount of war materials pouring in from Japan, but the heavy local buying of scrap convinced them otherwise. And this interesting bit of intelligence was promptly relayed to Parañaque. The guerrillas were also in contact with food dealers and suppliers. Was the country really feeding the whole Japanese army, or did they receive their own supplies from Japan as reported? And were always watching the airfields. They knew the type of craft based in the hangars and the number of weapons carriers that passed on the highways in the course of a day. And all these matters were faithfully reported to guerrilla hideouts. To Badel's bewilderment, he became the recipient of a part shipment of counterfeit Japanese war notes printed by American sympathizers in Australia. But Mrs. Mercado promptly made use of it to finance a string of beauty shops featuring charcoal croquinoles. But Pabi was the most brazen of the lot, having a hand even in the most useless mischiefs. Once, he instructed young boys to substitute stones for fish in the baskets being confiscated by Japs from a truck. Another time, he gave a Japanese colonel a hot foot during a rally. Before the end of 6 months, there was a price on Pabi's head. But he wouldn't go into serious hiding until at the end of July, a bearded stranger visited Mr. Rosal in his bicycle shop to inquire where my brother was staying. Pabi belittled the incident, but all throughout the dinner, he put his arm tenderly about Yoying's growing waist. She was pregnant again, and he carried the baby all over the house, swinging it up and down in an arc till it gurgled with laughter. But there was a hysterical quality to Pabi's gaiety even as he slapped our bottoms and told us to behave ourselves when he was gone. For a long time he closeted himself in the bedroom with Yoying, and when they came out again, Yoying was crying. "Get my clothes ready," he told her gently. "I shall sleep away tonight and come back for them tomorrow." That same evening, we were awakened by the sound of a truck stopping below our bedroom windows and disgorging Japanese soldiers on the sidewalks. We peeped to the shutters and saw them talking to one another, pointing up at our dark windows, and then a tremendous rapping shook the house, for it is a peculiar manner the Japanese knock, never using a palm or their knuckles like ordinary mortals, but the butts of their rifles, and not just a few times, but continuously, and loud enough to wake the dead. Father and mother sent the small boy who ran our errands down to open the door, and Yoying groped under the bed for Pabi's bundle of clothes, which she unknotted and dropped piece by piece into the clothes hamper. The boy unlatched the door and the soldiers came trooping up our narrow stairs, shouting for someone to put on the lights, and I ran through the house flicking on all the switches even if there was supposed to be an alert. There were 20 or 25 of them, including some Filipinos, and everyone in bustling high spirits, all except the officer, who stood aloof and seemed to be superior of their shenanigans and spoke softly, a passable sibilant English, and purl and sucked wind, the precise syllables like the hissing of water on a hot blade. The officer asked Papa why his other son, Pablo Sonido, was not home, and Papa answered that Pabi was in the province doing some buy and sell, for we were having a hard time making both ends meet here in the city. And Leo pointed to the wall on which were pasted Father's release papers from the Philippine Army, and the certificate from the rejuvenation course he had undergone from the Japanese. And he tried to summon the honeyed Nipongo phrases he had undergone so well, but like startled birds they had fled him. Namakura, as we later learned what the officer's name was, did not seem satisfied, and his men began tramping into the bedrooms and ransacking the drawers, forcing open wardrobes and tearing up the linoleum, unscrewing picture frames and ripping open the mattress on the double bed with their bayonets. But they found nothing. What they were presumably hunting for Pabi's enlistment papers with Ramses' guerrilla, as well as the copies of the Patriot, were soon neatly in the padding of the ironing board which was folded in the floor of the kitchen. As soon as the knocking had started, our washerwoman had sunk down on it with a stunned expression on her face like a fallen ox, remaining stolidly seated on our secrets for the duration of the visit, and the Japs never even came near her. Then a garrulous Jap lifted the typewriter from the study table and shook it, and my heart leapt to my throat as my drawings for the Patriot came sailing down to the floor. The Jap picked up a caricature, turned it over several times, spat on it, and threw it disgustedly into the sink. Then Namakura turned on Yoying, who was following us dazedly, suckling the baby, and asked her for a picture of her husband. When she said she didn't have any, the Jap did not believe her, and then Papa said he had one, and straightaway walked to the roll-up desk in the study room, from one of whose confused drawers he magically produced a yearbook caten by Silverfish, where Pabi had a picture that looked so little like him, with eyes very wide and hair like boar's bristles, that we had often laughed about. And Yoying ran for a pair of scissors, still suckling the baby at her breasts, and clumsily cut the picture out, and to this day we have the yearbook with the jagged scissored window in it.
The Japs conferred with one another, and Nakamura said they would have to take my father to headquarters for questioning until we could produce Pabi, and my father said yes, readily, and immediately went to the bedroom and told Mama not to worry, putting on his socks and his shoes and his sweater, for it was typhoon season and wet and chilly. We watched the Japs bring away my father, and as they walked down the stairs, I saw tucked neatly in the back pocket of a Jap's uniform a thick coil of rope such as we had heard they used to beat up prisoners with in Fort Santiago, and I had to run to the bathroom to vomit into the tub and was sick for quite a while afterwards. When everyone had boarded, the truck drove away, but we could still hear the crunching of hot-nailed boots on the sidewalk, for they had left two Japs behind to guard us. We went back to bed and couldn't sleep, and Yoying crept miserably under the covers, suckling her baby. Early the next morning, we peeped through the shutters and saw the two Japs still patrolling the sidewalk. Sometime during the morning, Bobby was coming back for his clothes. He had arranged for Yoying to hang a piece of cloth on one of the iron flower pot holders of the windows, if anything was amiss, just like in the movies, and Yoying washed several bright handkerchiefs in the sink and draped them casually over the pot holders, taking great care to look nonchalant about it. The next time we peeped, the Japs were gone. A pushcart rattled by loaded with skimpy coconuts. A bloated baby was dying on a copy of the Tribune on the sidewalk. In the middle of the morning, Leo called Mama to the shutters and asked her if she recognized the man in a blue polo shirt, who had, since the Japs left, been loitering idly on the street. And Mama said yes, of course. Isn't it that mechanic, Robert Taylor? We had given the man that nickname long ago because of a certain swarthy resemblance to that movie star. He was employed by Mr. Rizal to repair the bicycles in his shop. Mrs. Mercado had told us that Robert Taylor was a Japanese inform, being paid a sack of rice for every betrayal, and now we remembered it and became really apprehensive for Papi. We knew that even if Papi headed all of Yoying's multicolored signals, his mere appearance in the neighborhood would doom him. Robert Taylor needed no yearbook pictures to identify a name. Two of my uncles lived on Taft Avenue, but we were uncertain about phoning them, for the Japs were not above topping the telephone lines. So Leo scribbled a note to my elder uncle, requesting him to post a lookout on the corner of every street leading to our house to intercept Bobby and tell him not to go home. That my father had been taken away for questioning, but that he should not, on any account, tell Bobby that Papa was gone. And my younger uncle himself, we later learned, intercepted Bobby at Pennsylvania, riding home in a tricycle. Dan made a 2. The problem was getting the note to my uncle's house. Anyone who went out through either our front or back door would have to emerge into the sidewalk and would surely be followed. Mother decided to dispatch the errand boy. He was a 12-year-old and fitted easily through the bathroom window, and Leo slipped a rope around his waist and lowered the boy gently into the patio of the illustress. From there, the boy would make his way through the kitchens and backyards till he emerged 6 doors away from Mr. De Leon's house. And so we waited in terror, And in the middle of the morning, Yuying came up with the announcement that the baby was feverish and had been throwing up. And no wonder. Yuying had been nursing it with a sour and frightened stomach a whole evening. After a while, we were really worried about the baby's appearance, although ceased fretting and fallen into a shallow sleep, and mother said we might as well have him baptized. It might help. And Yuying dressed the infant up in his best baby shirt and wrapped him in a blue blanket that had been Pabi's when he was small eight. Yoying and Leo remained behind to keep an eye to watch out in case the chaps returned. I hailed a kalesa to bring us to the church, and mother kept saying, poor baby, all along the way, for she had always envisioned her first grandchild being baptized in a long gown with lace and ribbons and a big celebration afterwards, and would not surrender her dream easily. I felt the babies, and they were stone cold things and feet. We had the baby listed in the sacristy and were unceremoniously herded by a taciturn priest through the violet twilight of the church, illumined only by the candles on St. Jude's altar. Behind the railing, Mama held the baby's head over the baptismal font, and the priest trickled water from a pink shell on its forehead and pronounced the words that made it a Christian. And as I looked over my shoulders, I caught a glimpse of Robert Taylor under the shadow of one of the pillars. Pedro Sonido III, we announced as we proudly bore the baby up the stairs of our house, and Yuying poured some cups of chocolate and brought out a platter full of rice cakes. But we couldn't eat it, for we began remembering Pabi and father. And it was that way for many days, but Pabi never came, and we presumed that he had gone to the mountains. By this time, I had finished him stitching 15 pillow slips, and Badel pronounced as engaged. Once on our way to the queer, castle-like house in San Juan, where we bought the wooden shoes, he pointed out a small entresuelo with a window box of jasmine and said his father owned it, and would I like to live there? It was a tumble-down thing with fitted cornices, and I asked worriedly, has it got a bathtub? Has it got a shower? And Badel slapped his forehead and said, oh, Joy, you do slay me. You should be happy in a hole in the ground, up a tree, or in a cave, anywhere in the world with me, and I was sorry and ashamed for being so faithless.
Badal and Leo still met on Saturdays with Mr. Mercado in his bodega to mimeograph the Patriot and smuggle out the copies to its growing sympathizers. But Leo no longer went to the walled city for his translations, and his corporal friend Ito never came back to visit us. He must have been killed in one of those obscure skirmishes somewhere in the Marianas. The white bird piece had grown fat and noisy, the plumes of her glossy tail cascading gracefully like a royal train, and we hung her cage proudly in the sunshine of our windows, beside our orchids that had begun to bloom. Badal was now reporting to another guerrilla headquarters, this time in Cavite, and sometimes he would be gone for days. The Japs were zoning the area oftener and oftener. They could never discover which house was actually the headquarters, and they would rope off whole blocks of houses bordering the sea and order all the men into the plaza, and Filipino with a sack covering his head, with holes for eyes, would point out the guilty ones. But the guerrilla headquarters always had advance notice of these raids, and the guerrillas would already be in their hiding places before the raid began. Although once, they were caught off guard, and Badal had to jump into the sea and hide underwater for several hours. I was often utilized by Badal to take maps to Cavite. He packed them into bamboo tubes, the way one packs honey, and tremblingly, Esme or Rosie and I would ride with them in a carretela. But I wasn't a very good courier, and after every such feat of daring, I would come down with an allergic chill. I don't know if Mother knew about the maps, but if she didn't say anything, and there were many other things weighing on her mind. Father had been gone for almost a month. Once a week, Nakamura of the Kempitai paid a visit to our house to report that Father was still alive. The orchids had bloomed earnestly on our windows, and the sala was redolent with flowers. I think Nakamura liked Mother, because she had high cheekbones and her eyes were up-slanted, and she looked exactly like a Japanese woman. Mama would send Papa's clothes through him, and Nakamura would bring back the soiled ones. He never tired of hounding Mama with questions about Pabi, but she always had a sassy answer that never failed to raise her even higher in his esteem. "Let my husband out," she would say, swatting the flies savagely off the dining table, "and he and I will search for Pabi." How can I go looking for Pabi alone when I am only a woman? I would lose my way in an hour. Then one day Nakamura said, "This is the last bundle of clothes you will receive. Tomorrow, we are bringing your husband to the North Cemetery and make him dig his grave. You may make ready his best garments." Mother bit her lip, but she would not give a Jap the satisfaction of seeing her crying. Humbly, she begged him to carry a box of medicines to Father, to show him how much I care for him. And Nakamura chuckled hollowly and said he could not deny a wish for a condemned man.
Mother went to the kitchen to prepare her medicine. It consisted of mungo beans, which she roasted in the charcoal oven and ground into bits and mixed with powdered milk. This she wrapped in little squares of white paper exactly like medicine and packed into a small shoebox. Mother was as concerned with the body as with spiritual things, and she was determined that Father should have a good last meal along with his last prayers. Namakura had never before consented to bring anything but clothes to Father, but now he acceded readily. With Papa's best pants and shirt tucked under one arm and the shoebox under the other, Namakura bowed ceremoniously and said, "Sayonara." We prayed on our knees endlessly all day and night, and at dawn, Namakura was back with another bundle of dirty clothes. "We have decided to postpone your husband's execution for tomorrow," Namakura said with elaborate politeness. "You may come at 3 o'clock to the aquarium to bid him goodbye." We were in Intramuros at the stroke of 3. The aquarium where my father was confined was an old tunnel in which tropical fish and octopuses and weird deep-sea creatures were used to be kept in giant tankards before the war as part of the zoo. But now, all the deep-sea creatures had died, and it was used as poison. A foul odor of human excrement billowed from within. We showed the sentry our passes, and he let us in through a narrow entrance as dark as pitch. A shark could conceivably live in comfort in such a place, but a tall man would have great difficulty standing erect. We waited anxiously in the passageway, half standing and half sitting against a crumbling ledge. It was drizzling outside, we could hear from a loudspeaker in the yard of a Jap making a speech. He spoke perfect English, and except for the fact that he was envisioning a glowing Greater East Asia Coke prosperity sphere, one could mistake it for an American talking. After about half an hour, a lank figure appeared in the passageway, all skin and bones and drooping hair, peering intently at us through rheumy eyes. "Mama?" the apparition called in my father's voice. Mama walked quietly into Papa's arms, and we hugged him tightly and covered him with kisses. He was foul-smelling and unbelievably dirty, but a happy smile slashed his narrow face, and he said, "Let's go!" We could hardly believe our ears, and wobbly as he was, Father began dragging us towards the gate. Didn't that fool Namakura tell you? It's his commanding officer's birthday, and they're setting me free. Pablo Sonido Sr., the papers later reported, had been set free to show that the Japanese are considerate, kind, and forgiving. He was also suffering from malaria and had a racking cough. Because he was a personal friend of Captain Namakura, Father had never been given the water cure, or flogged, or hung upside down from the rafters. Although he had to wait for his turn like the rest of the ghostly crew from the ladle full of gruel poured smoking into the cup of his trembling palms, during interrogations, Namakura would come out from behind his grim official desk and drop down on the bench beside Father, questioning him almost reluctantly. From the very beginning, Father told him, "Namakura, you are a captain. I am a captain. We are both officers and gentlemen, and on that plane, the relations always remained." In the days that followed, Mother set about fattening Father with a vengeance. She bartered our typewriter and some of her precious gold dishes monogrammed Pablo y Olimpia for several sacks of white rice and a live pig. She went about almost in rags and would not try to get a new dress, since it meant that much less flesh picked from the bones of Papa. Bony Papa had emerged from the dungeon decorated with ticks and body lice. Mother boiled his clothes in a kettle in the yard. She cropped his hair and scrubbed every inch of his body with a stiff, soapy brush. Every afternoon after his bath, she laid him on the sofa and sponged him mercilessly with a towel soaked in Lysol, for the vermin seemed to crawl out of his very pores, and for weeks they would not leave their host. And while Mama scrubbed industriously, Papa howled to high heavens, crying, "Olympia, Olympia, you're flaying the skin of me."
Every day, Papa walked about the garden in his bare feet to absorb the earth, the phosphorus that would make him strong. When I whispered to him that I would love to marry Badal someday, he roared, "That pig speak? That nincompoop?" And I knew he was getting well. Mother didn't find it funny at all. She blamed the war for making us older than our years, deplored the lessons of love and subterfuge we learned from our neighborhood, the hard times that deprives us of lipsticks and pretty clothes that send us into the world like a pauper children. She swore she would not let me marry till I was good and 30 if she had to apply a slipper to my bottom each time I forgot it. When Yoying and I went biking with Rosie and Esme in the afternoons, Mother would send errand boy to trail after us. But we would pedal very fast and lose him in the labyrinth path and side streets, or send him some fool's errand for apples in the stalls of Bustillos. Painting, we would race up to the swelling rise of the Giant's Pipe in Avila Street, coasting off it in a delirious sweeping bump. We would jump off our bicycles and chain them into the hydrant and sit under the shade of some ancient trees with Padel and Nonong and Carding. Yoying would sit away discreetly and begin working on her macrame bags. Mother must have inkling of it, for we came home glowing and abstracted and suddenly very hungry. She told Yoying to stay home and tend to her baby, for from then on, she would go biking with us. She needed the exercise. Mother rode very erect on Yoying's bicycle with her hair in a net and wearing her yellow culottes while we followed reluctantly behind. And there were no more wild goose chases and delirious bumps and no dappled shade of macaroon bags. But there were still everybody parties, which were held at a different friend's house each time. And there we would meet the boys. The parties began at 2 and ended before the curfew's time. Each one would bring a contribution. Some dish prepared with much ceremony, Esme's famous fritters, Rosie's pinipig balls, Alma's suman, and my heart-shaped dishes of squiggly gelatin topped with the dribblings of vapid jam. We had a collection of scratchy records which we played endlessly. Moonlight Serenade, Inspiration, Jealousy Stardust, Why Do Robins Sing, Yours, Pennsylvania 6500, Chattanooga Choo Choo, Donkey Serenade, Siboney, and of course, In the Mood. We were all learning how to dance. We would try to cut a fancy step and dissolve into giggles. But as the afternoon wore on, we grew more and more intrepid till we could shuffle and dip and swoon. Mother could find no vigorous objections to the parties and consoled herself with sending a protesting Leo to fetch me at 6.
In between the dances, Badal and I sat on the chairs in the porch, holding hands, spinning dreams like intricate silver cobwebs. And when we danced, we belonged solely to each other. I could feel his heart beating upon the hollow of my throat. I knew I had but to say the word, and we would walk into a magic land. Through glittering tents, groves of myrrh, flowering odors, cassia, nard, and balm, a wilderness of sweets. For you are my love and my joy. We will get married. We will live together in a little candy house beside a lemonade lagoon. In time, love became a tight orange ball of passion that left us no rest it. Filled us upon the brim, burning our mouths like hot lava, and flowing over our arms and our bodies. It was there all the time, quickening every minute with its urgency. And one Sunday in October, Badal whispered, I can't stand it any longer. Meet me tomorrow noon with all your clothes in the store. In the blazing noonday sun, I waited for Badal the next day in the store. My fingers were fluttery. My knees were water. My heart was a swelling moon. An old man bought a lamp. A woman examined a wooden shoe fussily, shaking its velvet top like a butterfly on the wing. A boy with a mask speared a star pineapple from a jar. Fog in. You've given back too much change. Where shall we go and what shall we do? Can't you see you've wrapped the wrong pair? They don't belong at all together. Where have you gone and why haven't you come to me? At 4 o'clock, Yoying came to relieve me, bearing her scrapbooks on beauty and diets. Her tummy swelled slightly under the cotton skirt. She plumped down with a stool, sighing, and leafed languidly through the scrapbook. What's a nice name for this baby if it's a boy? She asked, clucking over her hairdo. Leonidas? Gregorio? Bienvenido? Oh, but they're old men's names. We could name this one new one, Nestor Vicente, and call him Envy. Do you like that name? No. Alejandro then. Or Paulo. Celso. Nick. What about Hitler? I said. Or Shylock or Lucifer. My! You're in a black mood today. Where have you gone and why don't you come? The shadows lengthened. The wind rose, whipping the striped awning of the little store. Yoying looked worriedly up at the sky. I believe it's a storm. Let's pack up, Joy. Gather the boxes, wrap the brooches, tie up the wooden shoes, count the lamps, and don't forget the scrapbooks. Is anything the matter? Oh, the hair the raindrops! Hurry to the downpour. Skip over the puddles. Run like a mad home. Sleep the sleep of the dead on a pillow, steamy with tears. Thermometer, Vicks, hot compress. Upon my forehead lay a stone and I was sinking into a gray sea. Hello, said the moonfishes. Hello, said the starfishes. Where are you going so fast? I am going, I said, trying with great dignity to stand on the clockwise of a whirlpool to meet my lover. Why doesn't he come up to meet you? Cried the angel fishes. Because I said, allowing a bubble, his very I swallowed another bubble. Very important. Do you have any idea where I could find him? Where else? Cried the minnows, darting like a quill silver in and out of the nets of my brain. In the cavern, of course. That's where everyone goes. Eventually, can you swim? Not really, I laughed, gulping a bubble. But you see, I can float. Float! Cursed the minnows. But you're not even floating. You're at the very rock bottom. Sea bottom of things. Well, I said, standing up very straight and tumbling backward immediately. I can always walk. The moonfishes tittered. They looked at one another and followed me curiously, their fins thrashing the water excitedly. And into the great hall of the cavern we entered. And in a somersault, I saw all the human limbs floating densely about me like a debris after a picnic. If you can find all the pieces that are yours, the gobby guarding the entrance said through puffed cheeks, I shall put them all in an old bag and you can bring them home. Littering the floor of the cavern were glittering arms and pale shining thighs and mouths that bloomed like a coral flowers, each never a twin of the next, but duplicated a millionfold, stretching for miles as far as the eye could see, piling up on the horizon at the end of the cave like a great luminous mountain. But what have you done? I cried. That you have all come unhitched. The disembodied eyes glowed among the seaweeds, the uprooted tongues shifted sadly in the sand. But I know, I said, my head feeling large, feeling waterlogged again. You have all fought in the war. Badel grew up to be a wise and great man. But at the time there was no hint yet of the greatness in him. And he was just as foolish as the rest of us because he came home from the mountains on his birthday. He bounded into the backyard and stole softly in through the kitchen door, where the family was at supper.
Mama and Papa soon learned about it and were presently in the next house, full of questions about Bobby, and Leo and I followed soon after. Badel's mother had scraped the bean to make a glutinous cassava cake, as large and ponderous as the cover of a manhole. Badel sat on a long kitchen bench, devouring a wedge of cake. He had that shining vitality about him that had often given me a start, but which I had not yet learned to recognize as the crest of his future eminence. Although his face had become gaunt and the lips were cracked and blistered from chewing castor leaves and half-burned sugarcane from the fields the Japs had burned, I could almost follow him in his journey down the mountains, bareheaded and barefooted in the sweltering heat, jumping on the burning sand to cool the soles of his feet, hopping from patch of grass to patch of grass, to stone and dried leaf, and that was how I would remember him through all the days and the months that followed, and through all the years, when on trips to some pristine spot in the mountains with a new and truer love by my side, we drove past the hot shimmering fields. Badel looked up from his story and said, "Hello, Joy. You're certainly grown up. Aren't you going to wish me a happy birthday?" So I said, "Happy birthday, Badel," and sat down beside father far away on the other side of the table. Badel had volunteered for this assignment because he once sold to be in the city on his birthday, and Bobby was with him at the beginning of it. They were to accompany Ramses' right-hand man, a peerless G2 known to them only as Obi, who had several times before stayed in the city in many guises, a boy in short pants selling coal, a janitor at Senior, an ice cream vendor, a puto seller. He had gathered gossip by standing on street corners, in Chinese cafes, where The government puppets lingered, and by littering around the garrisons in whose locked secret drawers reposed the blueprint for salvation, the three of them had set out from Ramses' headquarters accompanied by a guide, a wood gatherer familiar with the terrain of tangled underbrush. A vaporous moon followed them through the towering easy trees, sifting through the breast-high banks of sodden Salahib, over the confused foot trails barely distinguishable in the shadows. Suddenly, from the dense growth ahead was a weir of leaves, said Badel, and moving towards us came the blurred shades of a herd of caribous. Some Japanese and Filipinos were astride the thing animals, the sounds of their talk reaching us on the trail where we stood rooted in terror. Then one of the Filipinos cried, "Look, guerrillas!" and rifle shots spattered the night air, sending Pabi and the guide tumbling over me in the tall grass. I began to roll around and around, crawling in the brush, bumping over snakes' nests and heaven knows what else, hitting my head on invisible rocks, my face and arms slashed all over by the rough grass blades, for I was trying desperately to avoid the path of the trotting animals. But I had apparently misjudged their direction, for the next time I looked up, I saw them still moving rapidly towards me. In an oblique, disorderly fashion, I decided to lie still, and the caribous galloped so close by that a flank brushed my cheek, and a heavy hoof landed on one of my thighs. But no one had really seen me, and eventually the last galloping beast thundered away in the distance. After a while, I got up on my knees, massaging my bruised thigh. The moon had risen above the rim of La Mesa Dam, and it was quiet all around. I could see Pabi standing under a camry tree with a guard, and they beckoned to me, and together we searched for Obi. Then the wood gatherer climbed a tree and spotted a figure sprawled on the ground at the spot where we had first sighted the carabaos. Obi was dead. We dug a grave and buried him, and Papi decided that he should go back to the mountains to break the news to Ramsey, and I was to proceed to the city. For a day and a night, Badel made his way down the mountains, following the signs in the trail indicated by the wood gatherer. His food supply had run out, and he assuaged his hunger by stuffing the soggy fruits of kasoy in his mouth, or chewing on young leaves and wild roots. At daybreak, he had reached the outskirts of Manila. Rusty carriers were floating peacefully in the bay, and several Japanese, clad only in G-strings, were taking a constitutional on the seawall, believing Badel, after his weary journey, to be one of those casualties of the occupation, crazed either by hunger or privation. They had, in a jesting mood, grappled with him, hurling him thrice over their shoulders in an expert jujitsu into the sea, from which each time he came up splattering. Luckily, some hostesses in evening dress came following, strolling drunkenly down the boulevard, and the Japs moved on to a more pleasant divertisement. As Badel talked, Mrs. Mercado sobbed quietly in her hands. Mr. Mercado turned down the wick of the oil lamp to a sliver. The windows were covered with black paper, and the kitchen was uncomfortably warm as Badel told my parents all about Pabi. Pabi was well. In fact, he was one of the few who had never fallen ill. He was loved like a son by Ramsey, and stayed close to the American guerrilla camp most of the time. Once in a while, he was sent down on horseback to solicit contributions from the foothill towns, and he would ride back under cover of darkness loaded with supplies. Bobby's only complaint was the leeches, of which the mountain had an inexhaustible supply. They clung to his ankles and calves, and if he had tobacco, he smoked them out, and if he had fun, he had to pick them off with his hands. Bobby had killed 7 Japs, and he sent Yuying his love. Footsteps crunched on the walk outside in an instant. Fidel had jumped up and bolted out the window to hide in Mrs. Illustri's cellar. But the Jap had only come to scold about the light and went back to patrolling the street. At dawn, after he was properly shaved and dressed in clean clothes, before he left, Badal came to say goodbye. He stole in through the low window of the study where I now slept and shooed the grumbling maid away and sat uneasily upon a trunk of books. I looked at him through the thick mosquito net, wondering how I could have fallen in love with this zealot, this brash young patriot who had no room for anything in his heart but his own dreams. I rubbed my eyes, and he brushed the mosquito net impatiently away, balling it above my head like a mass of clouds, and he said, "I'm sorry, Joy. What happened? We were going to get married." He held his arms out achingly in the dark. "When this is over," he gestured vaguely, "I shall be back, and we will get married. We will live together in a little candy house beside a lemonade flagon. We shall be very happy. I'm sure of it." And Badal cried, "Oh, why are we so full of useless talk?" "Let's make it do," I said. "Let's keep it that way. I guess it will have to do for always." I was tired of kneeling, so I got up. "You'll change your mind," he said, and his determination glowed like a living thing between us. "I'll make you, if it's the last thing I do. Goodbye, Badal. Goodbye, Joy. I love you. Have a glorious war."
During the latter part of the occupation, no truck ever came to collect the garbage anymore, and the neighborhood began to dump the refuse on the sidewalk in the corner. When the wind blew over the rancid mountain, its stench and its flies filled our bedrooms, so that Mother was always at odds with the neighbors who would lift their eyebrows innocently and shake their heads in hurt. "No, not us, we burn our trash. It must be those people in front." And at night, my mother would hide behind the bitter melon trellis in wait for the culprit to steal out with his garbage box. The houseboy of Rosie's family began coming into our yard in the afternoon to sweep the leaves from under the swing and the bamboo benches in order to eat at the attis that had bloomed in clutches of dry, tight fruit. Rosie's family had evacuated to the fish ponds, leaving the boy to fend for himself, and the houseboy's legs were now bloated up to the thigh, as were his belly and his cheeks. Mother took pity on him and let him sleep on a piece of burlap in our garage, and we gave him our leftovers, which wasn't much, for by this time we had very little to eat ourselves, reducing to mixing cubes of Y camote with our. The day the Americans arrived, this houseboy was the first to hobble to the barracks, but by then he could no longer wear his pants, for his tights had swollen to the size of tree trunks, and he went around in a knee-length camiseta he had begged from Papa. All throughout the day, he did odd jobs like fetching water and scraping mud off the combat boots of the GIS, and they let him gorge himself on their preserved butter and salmon and meatloaves and puddings. Sometimes after the boy had slain in our garage that same night, he woke up my mother saying he was feeling very ill. His hands were ice cold and his tummy was severely bloated, and before morning he was dead. By this time, I was almost 17 and life had ceased being a wilderness of sweets. One cloudy morning, my brother Pabi came home from the mountains hidden in a vegetable truck, and he rejoined our lives as if he had never been away at all. We had long ago consumed all the wingless chickens of Leo's weird menagerie in the backyard, and now, to celebrate Pabi's homecoming, Leo tearfully consented to the slaughter of its lone survivor, the elk-horned goat. For it had already denuded the neighborhood of its grass as far as Vito Cruz and would anyway soon succumb from malnutrition. Father fed it some barbiturates mother obtained from the hospital and killed it as gently as possible. And mother hung it upside down to drip over a basin for 24 hours. Its legs dangled limply in the air like an imperfect cross, and mother hacked the flesh savagely and stewed the members in onions and peppers without saying a word. Even as we later partook of a more sumptuous meal than we had in ages, we would take guilty sidelong glances at Leo, and the red sauce streaming down the corners of our mouths and the burps rising uncontrollably up our throats. We felt shamefully and irremediably like cannibals. It was about this time that rice was 100 pesos per small tin of condensed milk. Kindling was 50 pesos a bundle that had cost 2 centavos before the war. And the beggars were always huddled over the garbage pile which they used for kindling to heat the coconut shells of food they had begged. Once Leo and I were walking home in great self-pity, for we had just bartered our blanket for several bags of fibrous tubers, when at the corner we came upon a trembling man roasting a bloody rat over a pile of trash. By the dawn of February 12th, we knew how close the Americans were because we could hear the dull booming of the cannons from the north and cover our ears and count 5, and shell would explode all around us. The troops that had landed in Lingayen had ensconced themselves in the Chinese cemetery and were shelling the Jap-held Rizal Coliseum barely 6 feet away, so that we were right in the crossfire from both sides. We knew that there was going to be street fighting, and the canals bristled with row upon row of dynamite. Japs in dappled battle uniforms with nets over their faces had ripped open a strip of asphalt in the middle of the street and were planting landmines. Sinister round objects with appended triggers. Later in the morning, they walked into the first floor and without a word began drilling holes on our walls in which to insert the barrels of their numbus.
After a while, we could no longer stay inside the house from the stray bullets that kept zigzagging through the roof, and we brought down what we could of our belongings and arranged a crude shelter in the concrete garage. Our main fortification consisted of a thick dining table that had been brought by a galleon at the turn of the century. Its polished mahogany, topped 7 feet long and 3 feet wide. My father and my brothers covered its top with mattresses and laundry bags and placed a cage of peas beneath its trestle legs. But the man could never be made to stay in the shelter long. Pabi stealing up to the roof to watch the dog fights, and Leo scrounging the neighborhood for the subterranean guerrilla hideout where Mr. Mercado sat sketching a map of the southern districts for the liberation troops, with all the mined portion marked, and mother often had to leave the shelter too, for everyone around knew that she was a nurse, and were always sending Leo to fetch her for a bleeding shoulder, a shrapnel in the knee, for some pregnant woman whom the bombs had frightened into a premature birth. And each time mother was gone, I left Yuying and baby with Papa to watch the dog fights on the roof. My roof had become a coat of many colors, the red of rust, the green of slime, the silver of some newer, grafted peas and gaping with the leaky wounds of an old and tiresome war. An airplane with a red dot would roar over chimneys, chased by another with a star. So low we could see the faces of the pilots. They circled warily, ganning each other, while Pabi yelled in my ear, "Devour him, eat him up," till one or the other plane plummeted to earth in flames, and our spirits rose or fell depending on which side it was. Down below in the street, a couple of Japs trudged by, clutching bayonets. Pabi brought out his rusty revolver, the gun we had been hiding all these years in different places, a loose board on the floor, a beam of the bathroom, the hollow metal statue of Pan on the balustrade, and savagely emptied its bullets in the direction of the Japs. One of them staggered and fell, and the rest scampered away for cover. But we must have angered them, for in less than 10 minutes our house became the target of such machine gun fire that we fled down the stairs in terror and fell in a tangle of arms and legs into the shelter in the concrete garage. "That was charming, Pabi," Yoying said sarcastically, nursing a broken lip from the heel of my wooden shoe, and the masked baby reached for its father with a beatific smile. At 11 o'clock, the Japs had begun to set fire to the houses on Taft Avenue, and we could hear the sucking, snapping sound of the Holocaust through the bared windows of the garage. Pieces of walls and roof floated airily in the air like scraps of papers in the orange-red, heat-drenched sky. Papa thought it best to move to the church, and we helped my brothers pile our belongings on a wooden pushcart which we rolled out into the street. Outside, a girl lay dead face down in the canal, her buttocks and her legs sticking out. People were all about, trundling pushcarts, hushing children, seeking cover in panic behind some wall. Whenever the plane staged a dogfight directly overhead, smoke hung thickly upon the air so that you could look right into the sun. Out of the fog stepped a dazed Esme, her dress torn, blood dripping down her legs. "Are you hurt, Esme?" Mother cried. She shook her head and rolled her skirt in embarrassment between her legs. "Where is your family?" my father asked. "I don't know," said Esme bewilderedly. "I don't know. I'm looking for them." And before father could restrain her, she had run away.
In the churchyard, we came upon Mrs. Mercado holding her husband to her breast. A shrapnel had flowed through his temple and uncapped his skull, exposing the throbbing oyster mass of his brain. "What shall I do?" Mrs. Mercado asked hysterically. "What shall I do?" She rocked him in her arms, and his eyelids flickered in sorrow, and she bent down and sucked the breath out of his fevered mouth. Mother fetched a clean towel from the pushcart and told Babby to wet it, and I looked away as Mother unwrapped it around Mr. Mercado's brain. And Papa went to search for some brandy, some gin, anything to dull the... We wet our own handkerchiefs in the fountains of the churchyard and placed them over our noses, for the interior of the church was filled with smoke. And we made our way to a side altar thick with marble slabs proclaiming a gilt letter, a wish of peace for the dead. Our neighbor, Mr. Illustre, came in through a side door in high spirits, for a relative had told him that Santo Tomas had been liberated, and that the Americans were building a ponton to take the place of Santa Cruz Bridge. Mr. Illustre would not come inside the church, but sat by the door with the bullets whistling past his scars, and folded his arms over his chest. He had inverted a flat wash basin with corrugated edges over his head like a comic helmet, and whenever he wanted to say something, he had to turn his head very slowly so as not to tilt the washtub off balance. But after a while, Mr. Illustre pitched forward, and we didn't have to examine him to know that he was dead. The parish priest walked down the aisle carrying the ciborium, a golden rayed sun upon his breast. "You can't stay here," the priest told the families grouped on the pews. "The church is choked to the belfry with dynamite." The wind had changed direction, and the fire was moving away, and we decided to go back to our house. We found the back part of the house collapsed and the sooty chimneys in squashed masses among the frames of windows and doors. Our bird cage lay among the wreckage, and Peace was lying on its floor in a mass of bloody plumes. We walked into the garage and cooked a meal of gruel, building a small fire with the wood of a broken chair. By 3 o'clock, the Japs had become desperate and were killing every male in sight. We hid Papa and Pabi under some pillows and bedclothes and sat on them till they complained that our weight would kill them faster than the Japs. Leo was nowhere in sight, gone on some foolish errand of mercy with a bottle of disinfectant and a swab of gauze. Through a gap in the door, we could see the streets strewn with corpses like so many dolls. A Jap stalked by with a fixed bayonet on his foot, tripped on a mattress rolled against a fence. With both hands, the Jap lifted the mattress and found an old man underneath. "Tomodachi! Tomodachi!" the man babbled, going down on his knees to hug the Jap's legs, and the Jap lifted his bayonet and buried it into the man's neck.
Soon after, several women whom the slaughtering had turned into jabbering idiots burst into the door of the garage. They were wild-eyed and barefoot and restlessly paced the garage. "They've killed every one of our husbands," Mrs. Rosal, who was among them, said. "We are looking for some cloth to make a flag." "If we make a Japanese flag," another woman said, "do you think they will have mercy on us?" "Look," a fat woman said, coming up with a red tablecloth from a laundry bag. "It's just what we need." She inverted a plate on it and drew a circle, which she cut out with the scissors from Mother's bag. The other woman helped her pin the red circle on one of the baby diapers, and they tied it to the end of a ceiling broom. Up and down the streets, they marched in a crazy parade, waving the flag above their heads and singing a Japanese song. Another woman poured out of the neighboring houses to sing and join in the parade. But at the corner, they encountered a squad of Japs who machine-gunned every single woman in the group. Then someone outside screamed, "Mrs. Tonedo, your son Leo's been hit!" "Where? Where is he?" my mother cried, getting up suddenly, dropping the scissors and the tablecloth, and a finger pointed. "There! Over there!" And we ran, and my father ran, and the whirring of the shells over us, and a grenade rocked the ground and we fell flat on it, feeling it trembling under us, and the people screaming, and the house in smoke, and the Japs gone berserk. My father found my brother Leo face down near the canals. A man lay cowering under the still warm body of my brother, using him for cover. His thin shoulders shaking like a fearful egg, and my father pulled up my brother's body, harshly away from the man. My brother lay on the earth, staring up at the petrified trees with eyes of glass. There was a bullet hole in his cheek, and my father felt the back of Leo's head, where the bullet had flowed through, and it was matted with blood. The smoke hung upon the sky like an awful fog, and the noonday sun was a dim orange ball far away in the kingdom of God. The bombs rained silently upon the burning world, and I sat upon my haunches and watched my father grow wild with the terrible grief. There was no sun, and there was no wind, but my mother went about putting things right, as she always did in our house. setting up chairs, and picking up after us children, and putting the kettle to boil. After a while, I heard her exclaim softly, "Oh, he's so dirty. Let's clean him up." And they lifted my brother to the shelter we had made. And my mother cleaned him up and bandaged neatly the hole in his cheek. And we covered him with a blanket and some clothes. My father sat immobile, his back towards us, refusing to accept the death of his favorite son. The earth was a wilderness of slaughter. Gaunt dogs detached a human arm here, a leg there, and where could you begin to dig when you couldn't find a spade? I didn't know where your yard ended and the next began. But although we watched day and night, our tears and our love could not preserve my brother. And after a day and a half, my mother decided that we should burn the body, and we knew that she was right. Pabi and I helped her lift my brother and carried him to what seemed to be our yard, under the shade of some banana plants. And we laid him gently upon the sod. My mother pulled one of the mattresses over him and soaked it with kerosene and lit it, and it began to burn with a steady yellow flame. My mother sat on a stone watching the body burn, and my father sat away from her in the shelter, staring at the cage where peace had died. That night, the Japs dragged our shelter from their secret hiding places among the rubble and the barbed wire and the burrows in the ground. And a stranger with guns stuck in his belt and bullets in a grisly row over his chest came stamping into our shelter, jumping right into the midst of us, and he said, "They're here! They've liberated PGH! You don't believe me?" And he overturned his jacket. "Look at my treasures! Look at all that chili con carne and spam!" And forthwith he peeled a tin, and laughing, proffered the minced red meat to us. "Where's Leo?" said the stranger, looking from one to the other of us, holding out his feast of meat. "Where's Leo?" And then Pabi said, "Oh, Badel, he's gone. He is gone." My mother always said, "My joy, be brave." My brother had been dead 2 days, but fresh bodies are difficult to burn. And I went out in the early mist of morning to look at my brother who had died. I touched the blackened mattress over him, and it puffed up and disintegrated under my touch. Half the body was already gone, and the heavy sweetish odor came untangled, and I rained upon it clots of mud. My brother was dead, and I could see my mother coming into the yard with another can of kerosene and matches. She was in an old dress whose prints had washed out, and she hadn't changed much, except for an aching in the joints and a flutter in the heart, and her hair that had become the tired white of wood you find washed up on a shore in sand. She poured the kerosene upon, crying silently, laving it like precious oils upon the poor disappeared parts. My father, he had not uttered a word since Leo died. An American tank rumbled by, and I had never seen one, so I walked to the gate to watch. The gate had fallen on its hinge and hung like a torn wing. On the littered street lumbered a large, muddy gray-green tank with stars on its body, and several pretty girls with lace around their necks were sitting on its top with some GIs. A guerrilla in a ragged hat was walking behind it, holding up the bloody head of a Jap. People were dancing on the streets, hugging one another with tears in their eyes And whenever they yelled, "Victory, Joe!" the GIs threw showers of candy and gum. One of the chewing gums in a red, white, and blue wrapper landed on the crossbar of our gate. I picked it up and kept it in my pocket. Because my brother was dead and I couldn't find the flower. But I would save him a piece of gum.